So we know human population is growing, and it looked like exponentially, but then we learned that the growth rate is actually slowing down. But we're still adding a lot of humans, and we still have a lot of humans on Earth as it is. And the issue that relates between humans and our environment is the resources that we need. And so the resources we use really dictates how our environmental health is. Now, you've probably learned about different types of resources before, probably renewable and non-renewable, and all those terms are okay. We're actually going to split them up just a little bit more because there's different implications, particularly with our renewable resources. So let's first talk about the different types of resources. The first one we'll talk about are inexhaustible resources. And this just means we have a continuous supply of something. You may have learned this in the past as a renewable resource. So some examples that you are probably familiar with is wind, sunlight. This is looking specifically at salt water, but really looking at waves and wave power. We usually think about renewable energy, and it's typically related to energy we can harness from inexhaustible resources. The term inexhaustible literally means you cannot run out. Just because we have a whole bunch of solar panels up, we will not run out of sun. If we have a whole bunch of wind turbines, we do not run out of wind. No matter what, we cannot run out of these resources. And that's why we've kind of strayed away from the word renewable, because renewable doesn't mean you can never run out. And we'll talk more about renewable in a moment. So we have inexhaustible, you're kind of familiar with these. On the opposite side, we have exhaustible resources. These are things that can run out. Now, I would like to say, most of the examples we're going to go through do come back. They do renew. However, it takes so long that it's not useful to humans. For example, fossil fuels. We have a limited amount of coal, or oil, or natural gas. But technically they do come back. It just kind of takes hundreds of millions of years, and that's not useful for humans. So don't think, oh, these can never come back. That's not true. It's just they can't come back in a time that matters to humans. Some other examples, these are looking at some metals. So here we have copper and aluminum, iron, gold, silver. These are actual things that once we use them, they're done. We can't, or the earth does not make more of them. Fortunately, however, these are typically things we can recycle, so it's not like it's used and then it's gone forever. Another example is not the sea star, but the sand behind it. You don't think of sand as something that we will run out of, and we probably won't because we don't use a lot of it. But if for all of a sudden we decided, man, sand is the most important resource in the world, we could run out of it. Sand is created from the weathering of rocks. Well, that weathering takes a while. So if whatever reason human society wants to go after sand, we might run into the same issues that we do with metals and that we do with fossil fuels. So again, exhaustible means we can run out. Inexhaustible means no matter what, we can't run out. And then our last category, going to a word that you are familiar with, is renewable. Now, renewable has a definition that maybe you, this might be a new definition for you. So these are resources that we use and that come back, but they come back in a time span that is useful for humans. So exhaustible resources were things we used, and some of them come back in a time scale that's not useful to humans. But renewable resources are useful. So let me give you a couple examples, and that might help you understand this definition a little bit better. So forests, particularly wood. Humans use wood for a lot of different things, and if we cut them down, they grow back. Now there's some implications to this, some that we'll talk about here in a moment, but we could technically chop down everything and it doesn't come back. So we actually have to be careful with our renewable resources. Animals, so for example, fish. Again, we can catch them, they reproduce, they come back. Freshwater, Same thing. You have the water cycle. Water cycle will renew that water. So these are all things that we can use. We can overuse and they don't come back, but if we're using them wisely, they'll come back. Sunlight, however, we could use infinitely and not affect how much sunlight existed. But if we were to chop down forests infinitely, we have no more forests. They don't come back. So it's really important to make that distinction between what an inexhaustible resource is and a renewable resource. Now we're going to focus a lot more on renewable resources because this is where our environment is hurting, so to speak. It is usually the mismanagement of these renewable resources. So when it comes to renewable resources, we as humans need to strive to be sustainable. You have heard this term before, and you have probably heard it in many different contexts. But the biological context just means how much can we take, or really the max amount that we can take of a resource forever without reducing how much is available. So sure, we can catch some fish, but as long as we leave enough fish, then those fish will come back and we have more fish and we can fish them a little bit and then we get more fish. So there's some number, right? If you have a whole pond of 100 fish, maybe you can catch 20 of them. And in the next season, they'll be back up to 100 and you can catch another 20 and next season they'll be up to 100. So it's kind of a number or an amount that you can take from the environment that doesn't hurt the environment because these are resources that renew. And so us as humans, our goal is to be sustainable with these resources so that, financially, we have that resource forever. But then also thinking about the things we need. We need shelter, we need water, we need food. We also want to make sure there's enough. Not for just right now, but for next year, and for 10 years, and for 50 years. So incredibly important to be sustainable. And I'm going to talk about some examples when we weren't sustainable and kind of the impact that has had, not just on the environment, but also humans. And we're going to start with fish. This graph is looking at the amount of Atlantic cod that was caught in the state of Maine. And this is looking at millions of pounds of cod caught. And that's what you can see in pounds, but then also how much those were worth. We're really going to focus just on the gray bars. And if you look in the early 90s, we were bringing in a lot of cod, we were making a lot of money on it, but then it crashed. We got so good at catching cod, we're getting bigger boats, we're getting better technology. In the past, we're just fishing lines. That's it, right? Just doing this all day. Fishing lines. But then now we got really big boats. We can catch so much more at a time. But we were catching too much. We weren't leaving enough in the environment for that cod fishery to reproduce on their own for us to catch more in the following year. And as you can see, after, I believe, 1992, we have these huge declining populations because we kept going out. We're like, oh, we didn't get a lot last year, but we're going to keep going anyway. This is my livelihood. This is how I make money. And then we put in a couple regulations, kind of effective, kind of not, and it's been pretty low. This is a lot of money lost in this local economy. And it's not just Maine. We're also looking at other northeastern states in the U.S. We're also looking at Canada that relied on this cod fishery. But it's not there anymore because, honestly, it's greed, right? If we can catch a whole bunch of fish, I don't care how much is left next year. I'm going to make a lot of money right now. I encourage you guys to watch this video that's about to pop up. It's looking at how the cod fishery has affected the other side of the Atlantic, looking at Portugal. And it kind of details this timeline and the environmental, but really the human effects of not being sustainable. So go ahead and pause here. Click on this link that is popping up above me, go watch that video, and then come back. So as you can see, a really big impact on the human economy. And that's not just limited to that town in Portugal. This can happen really everywhere around the world, and it has happened in many places. Cod is one example of a fishery gone wrong. There are tons more. All right, so let's move away from fish. And it's not just fish. This can be really any animal that we hunt, particularly for food. This is not exclusive to just the oceans. This is really happening everywhere. But how do we fix this, right? If I want to make sure I'm not overfishing, if I want to make sure I'm not overhunting, we have local government organizations that help to create limits on how much you can take from the environment. So what we're looking at here is Maryland fishing limits. I am not expecting you to memorize what the limits are for these different fish, but I am going to talk about what these different limits mean, and that is what I expect you to know. So let's take the bass, both the largemouth and the smallmouth bass, and let's take a look at these different ones. So minimum size limits. 12 inches or as provided for by special regulations. We'll just say 12 inches. This minimum size is saying if you go out and fish, and you reel it in, and it's 6 inches long, that is too small. You cannot keep that. But if it's 12 inches, if it's 2 feet, if it's 4 feet, that's insane. But if it's 4 feet, you get to keep it. That fish is yours. The reason for a minimum limit is that for some species, actually for a lot of species, the size of the fish relates to the age of the fish. Smaller fish are younger. Younger fish, just like people, just like mammals, just like a lot of species, younger organisms reproduce more. So what this limit is trying to do is that if you get a small fish, they want you to release it back into the environment. That fish has a lot of reproductive potential. But if you're catching much larger fish, they're probably older fish, and maybe their reproductive potential is a lot lower. Plus, as a human, this kind of benefits you. The government's saying, hey, keep the large fish, throw away the small fish. So that explains minimum size limits. And as you can see, it really depends on the fish species. Some of these fish species don't have a size limit. Whatever size you get, good for you. We have seasons. This is going to be very fish dependent. So for the bass, you cannot fish for bass, or if you catch one, you need to release it, between March 1st and June 15th. And you probably figured it out. This is the breeding season. This is when bass are breeding. And so if you catch one during this season, I mean, you're potentially stopping the breeding of that individual. So you can catch for them other times of the year. They've already bred other times of the year, but this season, you can't fish for them. The creel limit, although you might not be familiar with the word creel, this is simply just a limit of how many you can have. Some of them have daily, so how much you can fish for in a day. And then possession is referring to how much you can have on you. So if you have a multiple day fishing trip, let's say you have a 3-day fishing trip, you can catch 5 fish day 1, 5 fish day 2, but if you haven't been eating those fish, you already have 10 fish in your possession. You can't keep 5 more on day 3. So creel limit is kind of your more standard just limit on how much you can catch or hunt, etc. Now, for those of you who are fishers or hunters, or maybe you have friends or family that are, sometimes you might hear them complaining, or you might just hear other people complaining about these limits, but tell them, educate them. These limits are not there because the government hates you, okay? These limits are there to make sure that those fish are there next year for you to fish, that those deer are there next year for you to hunt. These limits are put in place in order to make sure that these resources last forever. If there were no limits, you might have 2 or 3 seasons of awesome fishing and then no more fish. We used to have that. In Maryland, we actually stock lots and lots of fish into our rivers. We have fish breeding facilities, and then we release them into Maryland waters just because in the past those fish existed, but then we overfish them all. So really important to kind of follow these regulations. If you want to go fishing, get a fishing license. Don't do it illegally. The purpose of those programs is to make sure that these resources stick around.